Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for an MP webinar covering workplace violence, employee policies, best practices, and tactics for prevention. I'm Katie Kreider, a specialist here at MP. For those of you joining us on a webinar for the first time, MP is a full-service human capital management company. We offer a complete suite of products and services to support organizations through the entire employee lifecycle, including recruiting, HR, payroll, benefits administration, time and attendance, and compliance assistance. We support our clients with cutting-edge technical solutions, as well as proactive, reliable service, and deep HR and payroll expertise. At MP, we are wired for HR and help our clients succeed by aligning their people strategy with their business goals. I'm excited to introduce your presenter for today's program, Paul Corellis. Paul has over a decade of experience in the HR consulting space, working with businesses of all sizes and industries. Paul leads a team of SHRM-certified HR professionals at MP. Together, they assist clients with compliance, training, and HR guidance and support for the full employee lifecycle. Paul also spearheads MP's employee retention tax credit services. This initiative has helped thousands of clients claim over $100 million in refundable, advanceable tax credits. Just a few housekeeping issues before we get started here today. If you would like to submit a question during the program, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. And as a legal disclaimer, this training is intended for educational and informational purposes. While we hope that you learn a lot today, the information should not be construed as legal advice. We will be sending out the recording of the webinar later today along with the slides. And with that, I'm going to hand the mic off to Paul.
Thanks so much, Katie. Great to work with you again, and welcome everyone to today's presentation. Definitely a hot topic on many fronts. So as employees return to the workplace, or if they've been at the workplace throughout the pandemic, tensions can often rise, especially when there are economic conditions going on that can create stress and various other factors as well. But workplace violence is unfortunately a trend that's seeing increasing numbers statistically, which we'll go over in a moment, but just want to do everything we can for the business community to make sure that you're aware of what's out there, and then also how to have a plan in place to hopefully prevent it from happening at your workplace. So in terms of what we'll review today, first we'll go over the definitions of workplace violence. We'll talk about what your duties and potential liabilities and exposures are as an employer. We'll talk about putting together a workplace violence prevention program. Some tips on potentially identifying potentially violent employees. In the case you do have an active shooter scenario, some response best practices there, and then also just kind of a best practices checklist as well. So first, let's define workplace violence. Make sure we understand what it is. It can take many different forms and can affect different industries in different ways. So, general definition of workplace violence is considered to be any act or threat of physical violence, harassment, intimidation, or other threatening, disruptive behavior that occurs at the worksite. Most people will generally think of assaults, harassment, things like that as workplace violence, but it also includes things like intimidation, threats, theft, stalking, as well as domestic violence that pours into the workplace. So as far as the most recent data goes, and this is from the Department of Labor and Occupational Safety and Health Administration, in their most recent study, there were 18,400 incidents of workplace violence in the United States in a one-year period. And that was they don't do this every year, but every 4 or 5 years they measure this. And this was a 33% increase over the last measure. So definitely something ticking upward. That 18.4 number is actually what was reported. They do estimate that up to 25% of incidents are not reported. So this number may actually be low. They estimate that 2 million U.S. employees and workers are affected by workplace violence each year, And via workplace violence as the cause, there were 458 workplace fatalities. So definitely nothing small. It's definitely a significant impact on the business community. So there are four basic types of workplace violence or categories. First of which is criminal intent. So that's generally something that doesn't have anything at all to do with workers, employees, anyone with a connection to the workplace. This would usually be things like an armed robbery of a bank or a store, some kind of theft, something like that by a stranger, someone who isn't associated with the business. The next one is customer and client. So that's when does involve people associated with the business, and violence between clients, customers, either with each other or with the staff. Most often you see this in healthcare, emergency rooms, doctors' offices, other stressful situations. You then have worker-on-worker violence. So that's when two employees, or sometimes former employees, engage in violence on one another. And then the fourth is personal relationship. Usually the offender in this situation doesn't have ties to the business, but does have ties to someone within the workplace. So this could be a domestic violence situation. That's when it's most common. It could be anyone else who's coming in to cause trouble with one of your employees or customers. So as you can imagine, certain industries and workplaces are more susceptible to violence than others. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, these are the top four. Number one is healthcare and social services, often dealing with people who are in stressful situations. Number two is retail and hospitality. So that includes stores, restaurants, hotels, bars, nightclubs, things like that. Number three is education. So unfortunately, we hear a lot about it on the news, but there is a lot of violence within the school systems. And number four on the list is what they call trades. So that's the transportation industry, utility companies, warehouses, things like that. So next we really want to dive into your duties and responsibilities, and in a worst case scenario, your potential exposure or liabilities when it comes to your violence in your given workplace. So it's really first important to think of this as a safety issue and part of OSHA first and foremost. So OSHA has what's called the General Duty Clause under the OSHA Act. So this pertains to having a safe workplace in terms of having working fire extinguishers and fire escapes and emergency doors that aren't blocked, and having proper safety equipment and proper training and certified people using forklifts and all that kind of stuff. But it does also extend to creating a work environment that's not going to promote or tolerate workplace violence. So the OSHA General Duty Clause states that each employer must furnish a place of employment that is free from recognized hazards that are causing or likely to cause death or serious physical harm to employees. There are also some state-specific workplace violence laws, and those vary widely from state to state. Places like California actually allows employers to seek temporary restraining orders against employees and their coworkers and company property, things like that. Other states have requirements for safety committees and safety manuals that have to include an element about workplace violence. So depending on which state you operate in, you want to be familiar with what the workplace violence laws and regulations are in those states. There are also state and federal leave laws that can come into play depending on the situation, including Family Medical Leave Act, Americans with Disabilities Act. Those can have relevance when it comes to workplace violence situations. And then some states also have specific leave laws for victims of crimes, domestic violence victims, witnesses to violence. So you want to make sure that when you have a scenario in your workplace that you're kind of going through this list and making sure that you're following all of the state and federal regulations that may be in play. Obviously, this is based on the scenario and is truly a case-by-case basis, but just making sure you're working with someone from an HR perspective who's familiar with the laws in that location and can let you know when some of these may be applicable. So as employers, it's crucial that we take responsibility for our workplace and our duty to provide a safe workplace and take that very seriously. So some potential litigation charges that could be levied against you would be for these following reasons. First of which is negligent hiring. So this is a term that comes up, when we talk about doing background checks and things like that. So not to say that it's often a source of litigation, but there is the potential for it, and it has happened in the past. So this would be a situation where you brought someone in and you didn't do a background check, or you did and something came up and you kind of ignored it and let them come anyway, or you didn't do a proper reference check, whatever it may be. And based on this person's past or criminal record, or whatever would have come up if you had done your due diligence and acted properly, you brought them into your workplace and then something happened. And through the details and circumstances of the case, they feel that you should have known that this person was a threat to the public, a threat to your workers, whatever it may be, depending on the scenario, and that you were negligent by hiring this person and bringing them into your workplace. The next is somewhat similar. So this is negligent retention. So this is someone you brought in. You may not have been negligent for hiring them or bringing them into the workplace, but based on something that occurred while they were employed by you, you failed to discharge or terminate them when you probably should have, because they did pose a risk to your workplace based on those actions. Again, something happens and then you're seen as being negligent because you retain that worker. Next would be negligent supervision. So that's when there's someone at your workplace. As a reminder, if you've been in for any of our management trainings or harassment trainings, anyone who's supervisory level or above is generally considered an agent of the company. So when someone's in that supervisory or management role, they have a responsibility to supervise others. If they fail to do so in a responsible manner, or if management is aware of inappropriate behaviors and fails to take action, that can be considered negligent supervision. Again, as we said, there are several federal and state leave laws potentially in play with these scenarios. So you want to make sure you're in line with those and working with someone who's familiar with them to make sure you don't have liability under those. And then, as we said at the top, there's also the potential for OSHA charges for not having a safe workplace, as well as potentially criminal charges depending on the situation. One important disclaimer when it comes to these 5 things: before making a decision to fire someone, decline an offer, rescind an offer, decline to hire somebody, whatever it may be, make sure you're talking to an HR professional first. There are rules and regulations around that, especially with things like background checks and those things, as well as issues when it comes to the difference between charges against someone versus a conviction and what action you can lawfully take. So just make sure you're treading carefully with these. It's important, and it puts employers in a tough position where they're juggling this liability for not taking action and also juggling liability when they do take action. And it is a tough predicament to be in. Just make sure you're working with some trusted partners who can help guide you the right way. So some more Bureau of Labor Statistics, or BLS, data from the same year as the Department of Labor survey. Businesses spent $130 billion with a B as a result of workplace violence. So that includes things like medical bills, workers' comp fees, legal fees, and all of that. In terms of some of the real costs from this study, the average out-of-court settlement for a workplace violence case was $500,000, so $500,000. If a case was not settled and went to jury, the average jury award was $3 million, which is just a mind-blowing figure. And in a case of negligence, the average negligence lawsuit award is $2 million. So I guess when you think about it, an out-of-court settlement doesn't sound so expensive compared to some of those judgments when the case did go to trial. So obviously not chump change here by any measure, and not as a scare tactic, but just to give you an idea for what's out there, and what some of the real costs can potentially be. Aside from these real direct out-of-pocket costs, there are also several indirect costs to consider as well when workplace violence occurs at your place of employment. So the DOL, Department of Labor, estimates that workplace violence can decrease productivity by 50% or more, and that decreased productivity can last at a minimum 6 weeks up to 18 weeks before things start to tick up again. From a retention standpoint, obviously another hot topic, trying to keep employee engagement high, keep retention high in still a tight job market. Businesses who stated that they experienced workplace violence also reported turnover of 20 to 40%. So again, not a direct out-of-pocket cost, but one that hurts probably just as badly. So just some more considerations when it comes to the impact of workplace violence on both the bottom line and the morale and engagement and retention efforts of your staff. So how can employers tackle this topic and really do everything within their control to prevent workplace violence? Again, it's not something that you can always be 100% sure is never going to happen. That's simply impossible. But just like with anything else, you want to take the measures and the best practices into place so that you can do all that you can to mitigate that risk. So first things first, there's not going to be a one-size-fits-all employee workplace violence prevention program. It just simply isn't the case. So some of the things you want to take into consideration and how you want to tackle them when it comes to your specific plan: the size of your company. A workplace violence program is going to look a lot different for a 5-employee company than a 5,000 employee company. You also want to take into account the industry. So do you interact with the public? Is it a high stress environment? What are the demographics of the employees? What potential risks are there based on the industry? Are you driving people places? Are you a factory? Are you a restaurant? Are you somewhere that serves alcohol? Are you a prison, a hospital, whatever it may be? Those things will all shape what your program ends up looking like. Also the physical layout. So just for logistic purposes, in terms of how closely are people working together? Are they having physical contact with the public, or is it not physical contact with the public? What kind of strategic plans can you put in place to evacuate people, things like that? Also, what resources you have available. Do you have an EAP plan that you offer to your employees? What other benefits may be available? What type of relationship do you have with law enforcement in your communities that you work in, things like that. And then the company culture as well. That's something to factor in. This is something you want to roll out to the employees so that they know what the plan is and that you have one as a reassurance, but you want to make sure it fits in with your company culture and doesn't seem out of left field, that it's in a voice that is something your employees will understand, and fits within the culture of the company and the history of the company. So really, I think the best first step is to get a sense of the voice from your employees. What are they seeing out there? What do they feel are the biggest threats? What keeps them up at night in terms of anything that may be of concern to them? So if you have an existing safety committee, you can definitely lean on those folks to incorporate workplace violence as part of the safety plan or meeting notes, whatever it is. Again, some states require having a safety committee, others don't. But if you have one, you can definitely lean on them. You could also create a separate committee outside of your safety committee, specifically assigned with preventing workplace violence. So that's up to you. You do want to make sure you have good representation on that committee. Representation both from management and non-management. If you have different departments or different areas, you want to make sure just that you have proper representation so that there isn't a potential situation that isn't considered when it comes to making the plan. Next, you should really conduct a formal risk assessment. So you want to evaluate what your risks are in your workplace based on your existing policies and procedures and any plans that you do already have. What are the strengths of that? You know, what are some things you don't necessarily have to worry about, or you current reassurances that you already have? And then what are some potential weaknesses that, you know, are vulnerabilities for your business? Also, as part of that risk assessment, you should examine past incidences. So hopefully you're doing this proactively and it's not reactionary because of a workplace violence situation that happened. But if it is, you do want to take that as well as any other past incidents into account. If you're keeping an OSHA 300 log, that's a good place to start as well to see what workplace accidents happened, if any of them could be considered workplace violence. Aside from having a committee, if you really want a full breadth response from your entire workforce, you could also do a survey to the staff to see what their thoughts and feelings are on the topic. Also, you know, don't discount the importance of a physical evaluation of your workplace too. So yeah, some examples of that might be if you have people who are leaving work in darkness, especially when the clocks turn back and even at 5 o'clock it's dim. If your parking lot isn't well lit, things like that. If there are other physical issues that could be of concern when it comes to doing all that you can to prevent violence in the workplace, those are some things to consider as well. And then for whatever policies you do have, review those and see, you know, are the employees familiar with them? Do they know about them? And if they do, have they been effective in having a safe workplace for your workers? So going back to those 4 categories of workplace violence that we talked about, as you're rounding up your assessment, you do want to compare those results to the risk factors from the 4 different types of workplace violence and what the likelihood that with a plan in place, you know, what are your strengths and weaknesses as it comes to these. So for the criminal intent piece, again, that's someone from outside of the organization coming in and robbing you or assaulting someone or, you know, things like that. So as part of the risk assessment, what kind of surveillance systems do you have in place? Again, what kind of lighting is there, both indoors and outdoors? What are your cash control policies and procedures? To reduce customer violence against your employees, you know, are you taking proactive measures? Are your staff that interact with customers receiving some sort of customer service training? Do they know how to de-escalate situations, or do they know how to escalate them to the appropriate people so that they're not getting into a shouting match with someone? Are your staffing levels in a place where they'll reduce stressful situations where customers are getting frustrated because there aren't enough people working at a given time? For the worker-on-worker violence, you want to study things such as your hiring process, what you do for reference and background checks, Do you do any type of conflict resolution training, either proactively or when incidents occur? Do you have any sort of mechanisms? Do you have a reporting structure where if employees are feeling threatened that they know who they can go to, or there's people they feel comfortable going to help alleviate the situation? And then for the personal relationship stuff, that can oftentimes be the toughest to control because, again, a lot of times it's an ex-partner or a spouse or a family member um, who's causing that personal relationship violence. So you definitely want to check out your physical security measures. What kind of access would someone who's feeling violent, what kind of access would they have to your workers or to your workplace? And then also just what kind of culture of support do you foster within your management and leadership teams? And again, if you have an EAP program or a crisis line or as part of your health benefits, is there, what type of mental health services are available or counseling services may be available as well? And just making sure employees are equipped with that information, both ahead of time so they know it, can hopefully get to it early, or when an incident occurs that you have that ready to reshare with them as a reminder. So, in unfortunate situations where there is domestic violence in the workplace, these are incredibly tough. Unfortunately, I've had to deal with these with our clients and their workers. Just creates a really heightened sense of fear within the workplace and creates an unpleasant environment. In this day and age, sometimes remote work can be an option in certain situations, but you have to plan for situations when that isn't something that's on the table. If there is a restraining order in place, you do want to ask that if someone comes to you with a domestic violence situation. You want to get a copy of that so you can familiarize yourself with the conditions of that restraining order and just be prepared and let management, front desk, whatever it may be aware of the restraining order and what actions to take should this person show up at your place of work. A recent photo of the partner can also be given to reception, security, anyone who may be on the lookout for this person. Even if you can't have them working outside of your workplace and send them somewhere remote to work, do think creatively, even within the confines of your workplace. Is there somewhere more safe within your workplace that they can work from? Are they in an office with a window? Can you move them to a more interior part of your workplace, or somewhere where they can't be seen, from the reception area, things like that. Again, just to reduce risk. Avoid including the employee's contact information in a directory or on the company website. Again, reiterate, if you have one, your employee assistance program, both before and after the incident. You may also want to notify your law enforcement in your area, just that there is this restraining order in place and that you do have an employee protected by that in the workplace. They may be able to offer additional protection depending on the circumstances. And then finally, just make sure you familiarize yourself with any applicable leaves that may be in place. Again, several states have specific domestic violence leave programs. There are also a number of other resources and nonprofits in many communities that work to help people in these situations. So just make sure you're acting as a resource and a protector to your staff when they are in these unfortunate incidents. You do want to make sure that every workplace, even if it's not too thorough, you do want to have a workplace violence prevention policy. For those of you who are HR services clients, we always encourage you to have a policy like this in your handbook. In some situations, it may make sense to have a standalone as well or distribute it separately. Within your workplace violence prevention policy, and this is outside of the procedures and all of that, this is simply the company's policy. You first want to state as a business, you have zero tolerance for workplace violence. You take it very seriously. You also want to include some definitions and examples on unacceptable behavior, harassment, threats, intimidation, physical violence, things like that. You do want to make a clear and easy pathway to reporting incidents within your reporting structure. So similar to a harassment policy, you want to make sure that it's very clear and very easy that when employees are feeling threatened or uncomfortable, or they're a victim of violence, that they know how to report that and are protected. And you'll want to make it clear, and you can decide how specific or vague to be, but just make it clear that disciplinary action may be taken when violations of this policy do occur. So very similar to handling issues of sexual harassment or other discriminatory harassment, you want to ensure that you're taking complaints seriously. Sometimes, there's a cultural difference, or someone just read the room the wrong way. They thought it was all in fun and horsing around, and the other person clearly did not. So you want to take complaints seriously. In many cases, you want to conduct a full investigation of the situation, whatever is reported to you. Even if you don't think it's a big deal, you should take it seriously. Obviously document it, interview the victim, and then conduct an investigation from there. Do ask for confidentiality, as well as keeping it confidential yourself as well. Keep things on a need-to-know basis. Obviously, there may be witnesses and other people you need to speak to about it, but really keep things on a need-to-know basis. It's great if you can have options for anonymous reporting. So whether that's through a third party or a telephone line or something like that, it can help create and foster an environment of more accurate reporting when there are options for someone to remain anonymous. And similar to the anti-retaliation provisions that you'd have in a harassment policy, you want to ensure that there won't be any repercussions for good faith reporting. So again, good faith is the important part there. You don't want people making things up or framing people for things they didn't do. Those things do not have protections against retaliation, but if someone's acting in good faith, even if it's ultimately determined that it was a misunderstanding or that no disciplinary action is warranted, you do want to protect those people from being retaliated against. Next, you want to review your current policies and procedures to make sure they're consistent with your goals of having a violence-free workplace. So again, you want to take a look at what your pre-employment screening process is. Do you do reference checks? Do you do background checks? What level of background checks do you do? Are you doing a national search? Are you searching at the state level? Does your state have its own individual criminal records database? Are you checking driving records? Are you checking credit? All those types of things. Just review that to see if it's sufficient for your business and industry. You also want to check into your termination and layoff policies and procedures. So it isn't the most common, but one potential source for violence is when there's disciplinary action taken against an employee or a termination takes place. So you clearly want to avoid any situation or actions within your termination process that could create a violent situation or create an unsafe environment for the members of the team responsible for performing termination. So you want to take a look at that, make sure, when it makes sense to have witnesses involved or another party. And again, make sure you're set up for success there. So to go into a little bit more detail in terms of some best practices for pre-employment screening, looking at work history, if a candidate has 10 jobs every 2 months, that can potentially be a red flag. If you do reference checks and they all come back positive, that's generally considered doing your due diligence. And whether it's for preventing violence or just hiring better employees in general, you want to ask open-ended interview questions, really lean on behavioral interviewing rather than just yes or no, or can you do this, can you do that type questions, just to give you a better idea for the employee's behavior, how they act in different scenarios, how they respond under pressure, just to see if they'll be able to handle the stressors within your workplace. You can also consider implementing drug testing, alcohol testing. Obviously, you need to make sure you're complying with state and federal laws when it comes to implementing those programs, whether it's pre-employment like we're talking about here or drug testing of current employees. And then lastly, you can always consider conducting criminal background checks as well. Again, you do have things like the Fair Credit Reporting Act that create additional process steps if you're deciding to take adverse action based on the results of a background check. So generally what happens under the Fair Credit Reporting Act is that if something comes up on a report and you're going to take adverse action, you need to first give them a pre-adverse action notice, give them a copy of the report to let them know what's on there and why you're considering taking an adverse action, give them some time to respond, and then if you do decide to rescind the offer or whatever it may be, then follow up with an adverse action letter. All right, quick question that came in. We'll answer this live. Do you have any recommendations or best practices on drug testing, specifically as it relates to new legalized gummies that contain THC? Yeah, so this can be tough. The best practice answer to this can vary widely depending on what state you're in. I believe at this point more than half of the states in the U.S. have legalized marijuana to some extent, oftentimes recreationally. So, and there have been some precedent-setting cases in various states that really prevent employers from making a workplace decision based on a positive marijuana test. Again, by no means does this mean you need to allow employees to come into work under the influence or accommodate behaviors like that. But part of the problem with THC and marijuana testing is that people can exclusively be using it outside of work and off work hours, and the testing is not able to signify that because it can stay in someone's system for days, weeks, months in some cases. So to accommodate this, there are now several drug testing companies and drug tests available that, as part of their multi-panel test, will not test for THC, especially for states where it isn't really applicable. That being said, depending on your industry, it still may be applicable. So if you're subject to the Federal Motor Carriers Act, you are still able and technically required for interstate trucking travel to test for marijuana. It is still illegal at the federal level as of right now. So many employers are moving away from testing for marijuana and focusing on other drugs that are illegal at both the federal and state level. So that's generally the recommendation. Again, it varies by state and what your industry is, but more and more employers are not considering marijuana as part of the drug testing process, just like you wouldn't necessarily test for alcohol. But if someone comes in under the influence or they smell like marijuana and aren't acting normally, you follow that kind of same reasonable suspicion test that you would for cases of alcohol abuse. Great question. So as I touched on a moment ago, involuntary separation of employment or being fired can be an extremely emotional event, and sometimes people themselves don't even know how they're going to react in that situation. You can kind of go through any or all of the stages of grief when the news hits you, especially if it's a surprise. And again, there's no fool-safe method to really preventing these 100% of the time. You obviously want to handle things with compassion and understanding, and know even in cases, and I've been involved in terminations working with clients and as a partner, where we had concerns that things might go violent or that someone, has a temper, and more often than not, the terminations go without incident. But that being said, you do want to be prepared. So some tips for safer terminations. Keep the termination meeting short and to the point. Don't let the employee engage you in debate or argument. If they want to yell or spout off their thoughts or argue with you, don't engage in that. Don't justify it or give them reasoning back. Just reiterate that the decision is final. Because arguing back is only going to escalate their anger in most cases. Avoid embarrassing the employee. So do all that you can to don't fire them in front of other workers. Try to avoid any type of walk of shame if you can. So in terms of scheduling the time for the termination, give some thought and consideration to that. You may want to alert security and front desk staff, especially after a termination has occurred, if you fear that they're going to come back. And if you do receive any sort of threat, even if it's just kind of heat of the moment, do take it seriously. So depending what that threat is, again, you may want to notify the authorities, take enhanced security measures in terms of kind of lockdown or check-in, check-out, escorts to parking lots, things like that, just to do all that you can to prevent any, nightmare scenario from happening. Another important thing to consider is just your overall disciplinary policies and procedures. And I will say, the more you work towards an effective progressive discipline process, the more you reduce your risk of stressful and violent terminations. Ideally, a termination meeting is not a huge surprise to the staff member being affected. So the more you can kind of lead someone and warn them. Again, if they're being violent, and that's what they're being terminated for, a different story. Again, we don't want those negligent retention claims against us. But if it's because of performance or other things, you do want to use healthy and productive disciplinary actions and progressive discipline policies to prepare people and let them know that they're on thin ice, or that there's a written warning in place, and further performance issues or further infractions of your policies will lead to termination. Hopefully that'll remove that shock factor when the time does come that you do need to terminate. But when it comes to those disciplinary meetings themselves, you do want them to generally be positive. Again, if it's a workplace violence scenario, different story. But if it's because of performance, you really want to use it as coaching to say, here's where you fell short. You are being disciplined for this, but here's what our expectations are, and we fully expect you to meet those going forward. You do, just as with everything in HR, you want to be consistent, and this includes your disciplinary action. So if someone feels like they're being singled out, or you're disciplining someone for something that other people are doing and they don't seem to be getting disciplined for it, that can create some real hostility from that employee against both you and those workers who seem to be receiving favoritism. So be mindful of that as well. If nothing else, you do want to equip your managers and supervisors with the knowledge and the process and the procedures for how to handle all these various situations we talked about. For those that are going to be involved in layoffs and terminations and employee discipline, you want to make sure they're properly trained to handle those in the best way possible. Oftentimes the largest sources of messy terminations, violent situations in these scenarios come from managers and supervisors who aren't properly trained and or get overly emotional and don't kind of follow the best practices. Also make sure they're familiar with those terms we talked about: the negligent hiring, the negligent supervision, the negligent retention. And then especially for people at the supervisory level, just like when it comes to dealing with claims of harassment or reports of harassment, let them know that it's not there. That's not something that they need to bear the weight of completely. Let them know who they should be talking to and how to properly escalate things so that the right people can get involved and it's not all on their shoulders. In terms of trainings that would benefit your entire workforce, make sure they're familiar with your policy on workplace violence. Conflict resolution can also be a great training. This both goes for preventing worker-on-worker violence as well as client or customer and worker violence. That is something as part of MP HR services that we offer. There are other sources obviously as well, but conflict resolution training can be a popular remedy and proactive service to help keep a peaceful workplace. It is also great when you can have a crisis response plan. So just understanding that in the unfortunate event that violence does occur within your workplace, who's going to be responsible for care of the victims, reestablishing work areas and processes, if you need any type of crisis management or stress debriefing sessions, who'll be responsible for those as well. So we talk about managers and supervisors. You want to make sure they know how to report things. You also want to, again, as part of your policy, make sure that all employees know how to report anything that could be considered workplace violence and that there's a comfortable and private way to do so. Make sure that you definitely want to document any reported cases of workplace violence, but make sure you're keeping those records confidential. Only share them on a need-to-know basis. And another important consideration is that these plans are only good if they're current. So do make sure you're regularly reviewing your program. Make sure note what changes have been made. Have your safety committee involved to make sure that the policies and the procedures are current. Analyze trends. If you're in an industry that's prone to robberies or other types of crimes, have you specifically trained employees, or is there some specific type of violence or method that criminals are using in your industry that employees can be on the lookout for? When you do have an unfortunate case of violence in the workplace, once things are kind of back, you've addressed the situation, you've taken whatever disciplinary action is taken, and you've kind of reassured the employees and got back to business, you do want to debrief and see how it went in accordance with the plan that you had put in place, if you hopefully had one. Some questions to ask yourselves. Was the response timely? Was it appropriate? Did the employees respond as they were trained to do? Are there opportunities for new training or retraining of workers? Is there anything we could have done to reduce or prevent the risk or the thing that happened? So in terms of within the workplace, again, mental health is a huge problem, really internationally, not just in the States. And so it can be a fluid thing where people may suffer from some sort of mental health crisis or other family or personal situation or a work situation or a financial situation that can trigger workplace violence. So a lot of times there can be warning signs. So some things you want to look for within your staff that may require you or be a best practice to take some action. Obviously, if there's any type of threat or intimidation, whether written, spoken, or implied, if people are talking about weapons, acts of violence in a fascinated way, sabotage or theft of projects or equipment, alcohol or drug abuse in the workplace, any expressions of hopelessness or heightened anxiety, Again, these are potential causes for concern. They're not a 100% guarantee that someone's going to take violent action, but just some potential warning signs. And sometimes if you combine one or more of these, then it can be a heightened concern. Some others are words or intentions to hurt themselves or hurt other people. Also, lack of concern about others and their safety. Irrational beliefs or ideas, or people just not making sense, or just a real change in their mood or their demeanor or their personality. Obviously, close ties between harassment and violence. Any type of romantic obsession or unhealthy relationship between workers or customers or even people outside of work can be cause for concern as well. And then finally, some other examples: displays of excessive anger, unwarranted anger, trouble taking criticism, which can honestly happen to the best of us, but there are times where it's heightened and of more concern than in a normal situation. Sources of stress at home or at work, or again, financial troubles, things like that can make people desperate. And then, again, severe drops in productivity, attendance, things like that. It might just be something where you want to take the employee aside and kind of see what's up. So speaking of that, some ideas for appropriate response as an employer. As a leader or a leadership team, you always want to show concern and support for your staff. So if someone comes to you, either themselves that they're having issues or is concerned about one of their coworkers having issues, again, you want to respect their privacy, not make this into an embarrassing situation. So you want to be careful of the words you use and the situation, the setting that you excuse me, take advantage of, but do show concern and support. Again, make sure you have all your resources gathered up and offer them up as appropriate. And it also might be, depending on the situation, a great opportunity to remind people of what time off they may have available, whether that be traditional vacation or sick time, PTO, or something under one of the programs we talked about before. That's more of a federal or state regulated program. As a general rule, for many reasons, but this being one of the most important, you do want to make sure that you're fostering a respectful and inclusive workplace culture. That has many benefits. Again, one of them being reduced risk of violence in the workplace. You do want to conduct annual harassment training and make sure you're distributing that policy as well as the workplace violence policy, and make sure people are signing off on that harassment policy as well. You want to foster an environment of open communication. Sometimes some of the biggest fights and arguments come from breakdowns in communication, so the more that you can foster a healthy environment where healthy debate and disagreement can occur without resorting to violence, that will reduce cases of tempers flying. So when you do perceive or know that someone does have mental illness and they're showing warning signs of workplace violence, you do have to be careful and compliant. You don't want to be discriminating against these people because those people are generally protected under the Americans with Disabilities Act. And again, this is whether you have a confirmed diagnosis or you're perceiving it. ADA does also extend to when management or a company perceives a disability in someone. So what you want to do is first make sure you're basing your concern on the objective facts. You don't want to be operating from a position of fear or conjecture. Don't just assume that someone, because let's say they have a mental health issue, is going to resort to violence. Work closely with a trained HR professional who can help walk you through it. If there is some real concern, just like you would with a physical injury, you can utilize a fitness for duty form where they take some paperwork to their medical professional, and that medical professional deems whether they're fit to be working or not. And then there also can be great situations to potentially offer reasonable accommodations. So again, you want to be careful and work with someone you trust from an HR perspective, but that might be granting leave. It might be changing their shift. Might be other flexibilities that are going to reduce the stress on that worker or reduce, some of the mental anguish that they may be suffering from. So don't fail to consider reasonable accommodations as a potential remedy to a mental health situation within your workplace. Lastly, and I know we're running a little short on time, so I want to make sure I get to this point too. And it's something I hate that we have to fit in, but it is unfortunately something we do want to quickly cover here. Active shooter incidents. So unfortunately, as you know, we've seen an uptick in gun violence in workplaces over the last several years. Statistically, between 2000 and 2013, there were 160 incidents and 1,043 casualties from active shooter incidents. 70% of those lasted between 2 and 7 minutes. And it generally takes longer than that for first responders to arrive. So because of that, you want to do what you can to know how to handle these situations should they, in the really, really unfortunate, and hope it never happens to anyone on this webinar, situation where they do occur. So some things you can do ahead of time. Make sure all staff are familiar with the exit routes within the workplace. If you are open to the public, make sure you clearly designate all exit and emergency exits within your facility. You do also want to identify a safe regrouping area. So very similar to a fire drill and any evacuation plan, you do want to have a place where workers will meet up if they need to evacuate, just so you can have a proper head count and account for all of your employees. A lot of more formal and lengthy active shooter trainings will teach the run, hide, fight method, which teaches people to think quickly depending on the circumstances and whether it's appropriate to run from the incident, to hide during the incident, or to fight an active shooter when necessary. Law enforcement, in the trainings that they conduct, stress the importance of thinking about in a situation, how you would respond based on the circumstances. I know a lot of us, myself included, until studying more about the topic, never really thought about it. And I wouldn't have been mentally prepared until I did do some training for it. So it's definitely not pleasant. It's not a favorite thing to do, but it is really important to think about the mentality that you would need to take on if there was an active shooter in the workplace. And how to use adrenaline to your advantage, because it'll definitely, if it does happen, that's definitely a factor to consider. If you are interested in an active shooter training for your workforce, there is an online training available to MP clients through our MP learning management system. It was developed by Tactical Advantage Corp, who's a leader in these types of trainings and personal safety. So finally, before we hit the top of the hour, a checklist for employers. And again, we will send a copy of the slide so you don't have to furiously jot this down. Do have designate a committee, either part of your safety committee or a separate committee dedicated to preventing violence in the workplace. Conduct a risk assessment, review your existing policies and procedures. Make sure you're disseminating your policy to all the workers and that it has zero tolerance for workplace violence. Clarify your reporting procedures, make it easy for these things to be reported. Do an annual training, and then review your plan annually as well. So that brings us to the top of the hour. We did just have that one question about marijuana and THC. So with that, I thank you so much for your time today. Hope you got something out of it. And with that, I'll hand things back over to Katie.
Thanks so much, Paul. Lots of valuable information on workplace violence, and the MP HR team is here to help guide your organization on any HR compliance issues. If you'd like to learn more about how we can assist your organization, please visit our website to set up a short 15-minute call. Be sure to join us next week on the same day and time for our webinar on wage and hour, conducting internal audits and maintaining compliance. Visit our website to register and to see the full calendar of upcoming events and available resources. We'll be sending out a recording of today's webinar along with the slides this afternoon. Thanks for joining us and have a terrific day.